This episode of 50 Shades of Planning is brought to you in partnership with Kratos Group. We are a leading communications consultancy, helping some of the UK's best-known brands deliver local and national campaigns, manage political and reputational risks, and influence national policy on some of the most important issues facing the UK. Find out more at kratos.co.uk.
Hello viewers, Sam Stafford here, reporting this time from a hotel room in Cardiff. In anticipation of the revised NPPF, my response to which I have stepped away from drafting momentarily, I invited some of the Shades alumni to discuss some of the policy areas of most interest to them and how the new government could and should approach them. 8 conversations were recorded, elements of which you might have heard formed part of episode 128 of the podcast, but I am publishing them all in full here on the YouTube channel. This is the 5th of the 8, which is a conversation between Vicky Payne, Wray and Paul Smith about new towns. Vicky is an associate at Bhalla Works and an independent consultant. Ian is an honorary professor and fellow at the Heseltine Institute for Public Policy, Practice and Place at the University of Liverpool and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. And Paul is managing director at the Strategic Land Group. Their conversation takes in site selection and democratic accountability, development models, promotion costs, hope value and land value capture, and governance and placemaking. Enjoy.
Okay, so Sam has brought us all together to talk about new towns, and I guess the context for that is that Labour have promised to deliver these 1.5 million homes in their first 5 years of government, which is quite a challenge that they've set for themselves. And one of the mechanisms with which they have talked about delivering this is through these new towns. So Ian, I know that you have some of the history of this. I know successive governments have tried to do this, both in the recent past and maybe further back in time. So I don't know if you wanted to start by setting the context.
Yeah, I'll take you back to the Roman invasion. Yeah.
Okay. we've only got half an hour, 40 minutes. So
yeah. Well, it's just to say that they're not a new idea. I mean, the Romans built new towns and cities all over the place. So did the Normans. But as far as British new towns are concerned, that goes right back to 1297, when Edward I got interested in new towns, convened a conference of town planning experts. It's unbelievable, that, isn't it? And made a lot of progress with Winchelsea. But of course, that was all implemented through the divine right of kings. Nobody messed around with Edward I. The kind of new towns we're familiar with really come from post-Second World War, lobbying by the Town and Country Planning Association, and Patrick Abercrombie's great plan for London, where he imposed a green belt and then surrounded it with this ring of new towns. Interestingly, he chose almost unerringly all the wrong sites. So when they started to implement it, the civil servants found that the sites he'd chosen didn't work. Not transport connected, didn't have drainage, didn't have water supply, etc., etc. So you've got to be very careful. There's the first lesson, that you pick the right sites. Now, those new towns got implemented by a really autocratic Labour regime because we'd just come out of war socialism. People were still very deferential. They did what they were told. It's not like that these days, as you probably noted. The second tranche of new towns came in the 1965 Act, Harold Wilson's white heat of technology, and Wilson was talking about planning, changing the country in a kind of way that Labour are doing now. We got 4 new towns out of that. Milton Keynes, Peterborough, which was basically a huge town expansion scheme. Warrington, which also basically was a huge town expansion scheme, and Telford. And in economic terms, they've all been incredibly successful. Milton Keynes, economic miracle, fastest growth area in the country, but Warrington not far behind, actually, and way ahead of the cities. So we're going to go into the process again, and from what I can see, I mean, you might disagree, Labour are hoping to use that kind of autocratic style. We're going to have it here, 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 and here in a society that's very different. So that might
Yeah,
cause
I guess I was listening to a podcast about this just before we started recording, and the really interesting thing is that they are simultaneously saying that these decisions are going to be made in, what you would characterize as quite an autocratic way at the national level, based on data, based on access to public transport, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But they're also talking about consulting on it, which feels like it could be a tricky combination.
Yeah, it will be, I'm sure. And I do rather fear that we will end up with people demonstrating lying down in front of tractors and bulldozers and digging tunnels, the whole sort of swampy protest scenario, which is likely to slow things down quite a lot.
I think that's part of the challenge with new towns, though, isn't it? New settlements, that it sounds easy when you say it fast. That there is this attraction to them because it's perceived perhaps to be a way of sort of minimising public objection, because there is lots of public support for new towns. But I wonder how much of that is because when you say a new town, everybody assumes it's not going to be near them, and it shows, as Ian's sort of potted history identified, actually getting the location of these things is really crucial, and it's really hard to do. You mentioned Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, and his new towns, and even with the divine right of kings, he, probably the most famous of his towns is Kingston upon Hull. But at the same time, he founded another new town on the south coast, a place called Nova Villa, which was just opposite, which was sort of down near Portland on the south coast.
Yeah.
And even though it had all the same sort of starting point and advantages as Hull, it was an absolute disaster. It's actually just all that is there now is a farmhouse called Nova Villa. That's it. One farmhouse. And it's because the harbour that was there needed dredging, and it was really expensive. So everybody went to Poole Harbour on the opposite side of the water. And I know that's like 800 years ago, but it shows that, you've got to get that location right, haven't you? And if there's not economic activity or an economic sense for it being in that place, then you're always going to struggle.
Yeah, but you've got to get the backing of the local community. I mean, Milton Keynes is fascinating because Milton Keynes actually was not imposed. The idea came from Buckinghamshire County Council's planning officer, a guy called Fred Pooley, and it was very actively supported by Bletchley Urban District Council, as they were then. So there was a great deal of ground level support for that proposal. Both Warrington and Telford were basically built on huge areas of dereliction. And so there probably wasn't much of an objection there. But it does demonstrate that, as well as identifying the right sites, you've got to get the local community in behind them, and you've got to convince them that you've actually consulted with them and not just slap the proposals on them.
But I think that Nova Villa example also shows you the kind of high risk, high reward nature of new towns, to deliver your housing numbers in a more granular way and spreading your risk and spreading your reward. There's drawbacks to that as well. But I think there has to be some awareness with a new towns approach that you're making a big, bold move when you choose to deliver housing in this way, and it can go very wrong. And so in a sense, when they're looking at site selections, they should probably identify far more than they actually expect to come forward, because a number of them are likely to stall for various reasons, whether that's technical, whether that's local opposition. They should probably, although it would be very scary for people to see on a map, look at far more locations than they actually need.
Yeah, they seem to be going for the designation of the sites after a matter of months.
Yeah, and I think...
all the previous, even Abercrombie has taken, 1, 2, 3, 4 years of studies and reflection before actually going for designation. So it's amazingly bold, and as you say, kind of high risk move.
But I think that also, that speed speaks to a couple of different points, really. One is, what actually are these new towns going to be? And again, we all think of Milton Keynes, but I wonder to what extent these are actually going to be urban extensions, or new smaller new settlements, more of a village scale. When the more recent examples of new towns that politicians have announced, like the Eco Towns project, if you remember that, they were, in a large part, urban extensions. And there are a lot of these sorts of new settlements that are kicking around already that authorities are progressing. So there's a big one in Leicestershire called, I'll pronounce this wrong, but it's Isley or Iley Woodhouse near the East Midlands Airport, which would be about 4,500 homes. There's one in Stafford, Meesbrook, which is an old military barracks. There's a big new settlement planned up near where I'm from, just on the edge of Samlesbury, near the British Aerospace plant there. And these things are all sort of beginning to wend their way through the planning system. And, one thing that Labour could do is, sort of get a hold of those and smooth their path through to coming forwards with all the, the money that's needed to pump prime and those sorts of things, because they are already sort of creeping forwards. But related to that I touched on just then is this issue of speed. And how you actually, if you're trying to deliver 1.5 million homes over this parliament, new settlements are probably not going to have any impact on that, because it will take a considerable amount of time to come forward, not just because of the planning process that we'll need to go through, but also some of the practical stuff about, if it is genuinely a brand new settlement, how you get the services and facilities and all the hard and soft infrastructure to it, and how that relates to the timing, the delivery of homes, because it might be that you need to subsidise some of these facilities so they're there ahead of the homes because you've not got the critical mass to support them by themselves yet. And there's all this sort of complexity, which doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. It just means that you've got to be looking at these delivering 5+ years, maybe 10+ years from now, which brings me back to where I started about maybe some of these will actually end up being urban extensions because they can come forwards more quickly.
Yeah, I think, that approach makes a lot of sense. Where I think they might have painted themselves into a corner slightly is they've made quite a few commitments, both in terms of the housing types and then also the standards of development. So they're talking about, exceptional quality development. They're talking about, I think, 40% affordable housing. And so the difficulty with rejigging sites that are already in motion to align with the new towns agenda is that, a lot of the decisions around viability and the master plan and that kind of thing will already have been made. So it's whether they can reorientate those things that are already in motion towards the standards that they've set for themselves in terms of delivery. Paul, I don't know if you had any thoughts about like the development corporation model and the kind of hope value aspect and that, that mechanism of delivery.
I hate saying it depends, but it does depend on the nature of the project, I think, to some extent, doesn't it? Because one of the attractions of an urban extension type approach, and I'm talking significant urban extensions, the sort of confident bites that David Rublin would refer to, is that they can, to an extent, lean on existing services and facilities, especially in the early stages when they're just starting to grow and before they've got the critical mass to be able to support what they need themselves. And land value capture, I think, in those circumstances becomes kind of slightly less of an issue. I think with bigger settlements like Meesbrook, like let's say it's Isley Woodhouse, let's say that's how you pronounce it, maybe you do need a bit more land value capture around those. But I think there is a role for the state in whatever form of helping pump prime those developments, because there is lots of upfront capital expenditure needed. And for individual developers to fund that, or even it is hard in cash flow terms. There's a lot of money needs to be laid out before you start getting anything back. But that's where I think land value capture can help by some sort of tariff approach. And I know Milton Keynes has a like a roof tax type system, doesn't it? And that sort of approach where the government is funding it up front, and then there is a sort of an extra over. I nearly called it infrastructure levy then. I can't call it that, can I? But some sort of extra over financial contribution for developers as homes are completed, and the state recoups the money over the life of the development. I think there definitely is a role for that, and that can help these projects become viable. And that's one of the things that, you know, the government can usefully do in terms of, you know, legislation and using their firepower.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right about the huge challenge for individual investors and developers backing new towns. But of course, back in the 80s, I do remember that the big house builders did get together as consortium developments, and they had 2 or 3 pretty major freestanding new town proposals, which they failed to get past Mrs. Thatcher in the 80s. It was called consortium developments, and the best known of them was a site called Tillingham Hall. They brought in the new town planners from Milton Keynes. So if the scale of financial backing is big enough, I don't think you could you could rule out private sector investment. That Labour are talking about private sector investment, but they're not talking about it in a really big way. It seems to me that if you're going for a big project as big as Milton Keynes, and this would have to be a second-term project for Labour, not a first-term project, then there's no reason why you couldn't sell it to financial institutions, sovereign wealth funds, and so on the basis that they fund the upfront basic infrastructure and then have a long-term interest in the land of some sort. It would seem to me to be an incredible blue chip investment opportunity. But I don't think Labour are thinking in these terms at the moment. And that might be partly because the Town and Country Planning Association, bodies like that want new towns, don't want to get involved with that kind of private sector development model. But I don't think you should rule it out. I think, incidentally, the other feeling I'm getting from this discussion is that maybe in the first term, what they need to do is a repackaging exercise and repackage projects which are already running through the system and are almost up and running as new towns, and assist them through. And the new towns, in a strict sense, would come forward in the second term, because you've got a lot of consultation to do. And I mentioned earlier when we were having the pre-discussion, environmental impact assessment and all of that. I mean, how long is that going to take?
And I guess, yeah, the point about private sector involvement, they've set themselves some very specific parameters more generally about how they're approaching things in terms of their economic policy, in terms of borrowing and public spending. So they probably don't have many places to go in terms of delivering it via the public sector route. Yeah. So I think you're right. I think they are going to have to go down kind of private master developer model.
Yeah.
And that can be done where there is some certainty around it. And you know, one of the difficulties is the cost of promoting a project of this sort of scale is vast. And if there is you know, an uncertain prospect of success, you know, how much money are you actually willing to commit to prove this scheme is deliverable? And I think what's interesting in that context is the new local plan system that the last government was sort of on the verge of introducing, and which, as I understand it, Labour are going to, at least in broad terms, stick to. That introduced this concept of supplementary plans, which would sit alongside the main local plan document, were prepared in isolation. And one of the criteria for those is that they had to be site specific. And, you know, new towns, new settlements is one potential use for those. You know, I think they were almost envisaged to be used for if you've got a major employer that goes out of business, and obviously you've got a massive industrialist site that crops up and you need to do something quickly. But you could use it for a new settlement too, and say, well, okay, you know, here's a supplementary plan that designates this area for a new settlement, and you can then start including lots of the planning policy requirements in there, take it through consultation as part of that process, rather than sort of it being beholden to the wider local plan process, which it is, again, it is an added layer of complexity. If your whole local plan, the soundness of your whole local plan is dependent upon whether or not a new settlement is found to be deliverable by a planning inspector. I mean, that's like putting all your chips on, on red at the casino, isn't it? It's not. It's a brave local authority that tries to go down that route.
Yeah, risk is an enormously big issue here, and that's partly because of the huge timescales involved. You think about Warrington New Town, designated in 1968, and they are still building out the southern growth areas, the land which was purchased for the new town. But maybe Warrington does offer a bit of a lesson here, because Warrington was basically implemented in a modular fashion. So there were 3 big development areas hooked onto the existing settlement. One off in the northeast, which was a huge abandoned ordnance factory. One in the northwest, which was an abandoned US Air Force airfield. And then the green fields to the south of Warrington. So if you've got a lot of risk, then you do need to develop in a modular kind of way, don't you? So that you can deliver a bit. I mean, every house builder knows this. They put an access road in and they build a few houses, and they don't go any further if they ain't selling. So it's a question of timescales and modularity, I think, to solve this problem.
There is still a fundamental question there around site selection, because in that supplementary plan model, like, is what you're consulting on the principle of development in that location, or is it the detail of how that development would come forward? Because at the moment, the only mechanism that we have to consult on site selection and broad spatial strategy is the local plan process, which, as we know, is incredibly slow. So it's hard to imagine a mechanism by which these would be brought forward in a way that is simultaneously democratic and fast.
Yeah, I mean, a supplementary plan could be used to consult on the principle. It wouldn't need to focus on the detail. And I think, one of the attractions of it is, again, if you look at the local plan process at the minute and a local authority sort of promoting a new settlement, one of the challenges they have is the lead-in periods for these sorts of projects are so big that you might allocate a new settlement for 4,500, 5,000 homes. But how many of those are going to deliver in the plan period?
Yeah.
It's not a huge proportion often. So councils can end up taking a lot of political pain for talking about a really big project and getting very little immediate political benefit through not having to allocate other sites in other locations. Whereas a supplementary plan route doing, or any way of doing this sort of alongside or outside the local plan process can help diffuse some of that, I think, by helping properly frame it in terms of, this is something different. This is for the longer term. Maybe it's a regional thing. It's a strategic planning type issue, and sell the principle in a different way. For then, things like design codes to follow on that can govern exactly what it's going to look like and make sure they are of exceptional quality, I think is the phrase that Labour have used, isn't it?
A new settlement is something entirely different in a sense, even from a large housing allocation. It's much more akin to a large infrastructure project than it is a conventional kind of site development route, depending on the scale. And so maybe there is an argument for quite a different way of going through that process.
But do you feel that, in a sense, we're all groping in the dark here? Because it's a long time since we did this in this country, and all the people who did it have gone. They've retired. They've even passed away. So we are basically trying to reinvent something where we've forgotten how the wheel works. But you see, I just wonder how environmental impact assessment, sustainability appraisals, the demonstration of alternatives is going to work in a process like this. I can see the door open there to all kinds of legal challenges, basically.
I guess we had the Garden Communities Programme and that kind of thing, which is kind of a new settlement process just by a different name. And there have been some examples of those that have come through that are getting delivered and are reasonably successful. So I went to Waterbeach recently in Cambridgeshire, which they've started to deliver the first phases of that. And I think it does hang together as a place, and it's got the kind of the bones and the starting point of a real settlement. But then there are other examples where it just hasn't worked in the same way. And I think one of the areas of risk that I'm concerned about is how quality is going to be ensured in these places, not even so much from a policy perspective, because we have mechanisms for this, we have design codes, we have standards, but it's the decisions that are made at the master planning level about what these places should look like. Because I think we've seen a lot, often they're delivered outside of urban areas, so in a sort of suburban or rural context. And this leads people to go down the route of what people tend to call a landscape-led master plan, which, unlike what I would see a landscape-led master plan as being, which is having kind of density in the right places and the landscape coming in from the outside, people seem to go for a very low density and then have huge swathes of green space kind of splitting up parcels into these little nucleuses, which don't look like any place that has evolved naturally and don't function well in terms of being able to support local services and public transport nodes. And so I have concerns about the actual design conception of some of these places. I read an academic paper recently about Camborne, and it was doing some analysis of resident experiences of living there. And the whole Newtown blues phenomenon is a real thing, that people had discernible mental health impacts of moving to that place and living in that environment, because it just didn't have the kind of vibrancy and vitality that people kind of expect from living in a community.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Is that because people are coming at this from a kind of garden city, new town perspective, traditional garden city perspective, rather than from an urbanism perspective?
And I think that's a really interesting point, because it speaks to sort of the interaction of lots of different pressures on these sort of settlements. And you're right, when we say new towns, people automatically think, garden towns and Ebenezer Howard, and it's all going to be big gardens and lots of green space. And that's people's perception of it. And politicians can be quite keen to lean into that as well, I think.
Yeah.
And if you're not careful, you do end up with these sort of low density developments with, because of lots of the sort of the ecological and ecological requirements about retaining hedgerows and trees and all these sorts of things, you can get quite fragmented schemes that perhaps wouldn't be what you started with, what you would do in an ideal world, if somewhere was growing more organically. But I think also it's about, like I say, it's about some of all these competing pressures, because we have done some of these things more recently, but the challenge is where you need input from lots of different areas, lots of different government departments, lots of different players. That can cause a challenge in and of itself. And I'm reminded of the Balerig Garden Village in Lancaster, which is a 5,000 home new settlement on the southern edge of Lancaster that's meant to take sort of the lion's share of their housing need. And to deliver access to that, there was going to be a new motorway junction built on the M6. And they can't afford it. They were awarded funding, but because of build cost inflation and actually projects like that, they always seem to run over budget, don't they? Turned out that they didn't actually have enough money to deliver that motorway junction. Those improvements have been, it was a motorway junction and a link road. That bit of the work has been scrapped. And where does that leave the garden village itself? I'm not sure it can actually practically deliver in the way that was envisaged. And it's how we knit all of these things together, isn't it? The design requirements, the other competing players, or the environmental assessments. And that's why these things take time and are sort of so fraught with risk. It is the highest risk way of delivering new housing, I would suggest.
I think there is also there's obvious commercial sensitivities to the process, because at the end of the day, if you're a master developer, you need to be able to sell parcels to people to take forward, and then those people need to be able to sell to customers. And when we've been doing some analysis, we've been working on some larger kind of new settlement type projects, and it's really interesting to see some of them in the early phases didn't get the buy-in either from delivery partners or from consumers in the kind of typologies that were available. And I think you have to think quite carefully about what people are wanting from moving to these places. So often when early phases are delivered, they're delivered around wherever the centre is to be planned. And those are often higher density, sometimes apartment or townhouse typologies with maybe a bit less amenity space. But if you're a person moving out of an existing settlement to try and get some more space, maybe you're going to work from home more, maybe you're going to start a family, actually what you're wanting is often those kind of detached typologies, the garden, you know, and the amenity space. And I think there's something to do with aligning phasing and typology that is a little bit counterintuitive to the way that places naturally develop. You know, historically, you would say like they grow out from the center, but it might be that your early adopters want the more kind of outer area, detached typologies, more amenity space, and you're not going to get buy-in from the people that want like maybe some apartment living, a bit more vibrancy until the later phases when there's actually a bit of critical mass, because those people don't want to move to a new location that only has, you know, 10-15% of what will eventually be its existing resident population. So I think we need to challenge ourselves a little bit to look at the way that places naturally evolve and adjust some of our thinking around how you deliver and phase some of this stuff.
Yeah, I think you can only get that combination of dwelling and development types, basically, if you go for expansion of existing settlements, because then you are almost automatically providing a whole range of facilities in terms of the plot sizes, the leaseholds, the sub-markets that operate. You don't get that on a completely greenfield new town development site. But just going back to a point that Paul raised, and that was the cost of major off-site works, the costs of actually getting the ball rolling. You can't forget about what might be described as the whole sweetener package that you're going to have to install to get local communities to accept this scale of development and for it to work. And you know, those are the costs of health facilities, schools, social services, even policing. All of that basic infrastructure is going to have to be provided so that people don't feel the cost of accepting development as big as this is that their local service provision is going to decline dramatically. In fact, you've got to convince them that it's going to improve dramatically.
And I guess that is part of the advantage of places having maybe not so close as an urban extension, because that then isn't really a new settlement. But Paul referred to David, my colleague's work on the Wolfson Prize-winning essay on garden communities. And I worked at Urbed for a long time, and we did some work trying to deliver sites of that nature. And the principle is for them to have a really close relationship and a really good connection to an existing higher tier settlement that has all of those services. And then the argument becomes not just that the residents from the new community have access to all of those, but actually those town centres, we know that our high streets across the UK are struggling, and there's kind of nothing better than increasing your population density around a high street to support it. So that can be part of the case making to the local community. You know, this new settlement is hopefully going to help support our shops and services and things that people really value about the place.
Yeah. So have we moved towards almost concluding that we don't want new towns, we want expanded towns?
Well, I think, you know, I think when we face such an acute housing supply shortage, you know, the phrase that I always use is that we need all the players on the pitch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think there's space for all of these things, but we need to be realistic about the challenges that the bigger the development becomes, the harder and more challenging and riskier it becomes.
And the longer the timescales.
Yeah, and along with the
Well,
timescales, and we just need to be realistic about that and be really sort of single-mindedly focused on the location of these things, because that is, that is the key determinant, really, as to whether or not these places are going to succeed. Everything else can be made to work, but the location is the one thing that you can't change during the process if you're getting it wrong, right?
Yeah.
And I know there was some chat, wasn't there? Was it last week, the week before, about I think it's called Tempsford, the village in where the East-West Railway line that's running between Oxford and Cambridge will have will intersect with the East Coast Main Line. There's going to be a station there, and you think, well, maybe somewhere like that, maybe that could work because it's got really, really good transport infrastructure.
Yeah.
There'll be other places like that, where there is really good existing transport infrastructure near to places that are economically strong, where there is already a shortage of housing, that maybe they could support a really, really big new settlement. But that's not the whole answer. That can only ever be part of the answer.
The latest blog post about joining the dots on some of the mechanisms that Labour is talking about for delivering housing. And I think that point around alignment with various wider strategies. So they have a national infrastructure strategy, they have a national industrial strategy, and it feels like the missing piece of that is some kind of national housing strategy, which might include locations for some of these places, because there is a risk, I think, of viewing all of those components, if not separately, then just slightly in a misaligned way, slightly misaligned timescales. Maybe there's a bit of siloing about who's thinking about this at what time. Whereas if you brought all of that thinking together, there's a huge amount of benefit that could be achieved, especially because they're linking a lot of their rhetoric around housing, not just about addressing the housing crisis, but about growth and productivity and boosting the economy.
Of course, the problem is nobody's doing this type of thinking, are they? We're still locked in the traditional Whitehall silos. We've got the Transport Department thinking about transport. We've got the Environment Department thinking about flood defence priorities. We've got Business Department thinking about business. And we've got communities and local government thinking about housing. There's nobody at the centre. Maybe the Treasury would like to think they were at the centre. And the way things are actually running, it was really interesting to hear the Chancellor of the Exchequer answering questions about planning in the Commons the other day. So my suggestion, which was in a rather long letter in the FT on Monday, is that in fact we ought to embrace the Treasury and encourage them to work as a growth and finance ministry and not simply as a finance ministry. Now, whether that will ever come to pass, we'll see. But at the moment, there's clearly nobody who's pulling the whole picture together.
But I think that's what joining up the efforts of different departments is one of the areas when Labour do seem to be trying to do things a little bit differently, don't they? And there's an article in the Economist this week about the mission-led government that they're trying to introduce, where they've got these mission panels where I suppose it's a function of the fact that the cabinet is too big to make decisions, right? So they're picking the particular missions that they want to focus on and having smaller sub-teams that are going to do that with power to try and, bring in the required resources from different departments. And that, maybe they need one of those around housing. And one of the suggestions that was made in The Economist, which I thought was interesting, is that one of the challenges at the moment is that different departments get their own funding pots and they sort of jealously guard it. And if the DFT's got money to spend on transport infrastructure, does it want to spend it on setting up a new settlement, or would it rather spend it on somewhere else? And the suggestion was maybe these mission boards should be given their own budgets. And therefore the DFT only gets money to spend on new infrastructure if they are, some of their infrastructure budget is taken off them and put in the housing mission team. And if they want to be able to spend that in the DFT, they've got to cooperate. There are ways of doing this, even within the current government structures, I think. And it'll be interesting to see, as we get more detail on this over the coming weeks and months, what route, what solutions that Labour try and come up with.
Yeah, we're slightly going off agenda here, aren't we? But it does seem to me that to make this work, and to make it work, particularly if you're talking about really big infrastructure projects, you've got to have coherent planning at a number of scales.
Yeah.
You can't just set up a small number of independent new town projects and hope that they can kind of sail off under their own power, as it were.
Yeah, you need to integrate your land use planning with transport planning, with energy planning, health provision planning, education planning. They all need to, at the bigger scale, all of those things need to be working together. And like I say, I know I keep making the point, but that's why the bigger projects are really, really hard to deliver.
Yeah. We're kind of working our way up to the idea that firstly, there should be a national spatial plan, and also that planners should be involved in every aspect of government and possibly running the country.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think Paul's really interesting point is the need to have this budget, which is not really a departmental budget, and it can be used to lever other budgets. I mean, when I worked in a regional development agency, although our budget was quite modest compared to the amount of money that was coming into the region from other budgets, it was an incredibly important catalytic budget. So, if a particular project wanted to go ahead, we could say, well, we'll support that. We'll put 5 or 10% in, and we'll do the feasibility study. And then you could bring other actors in, private sector and public sector, and get behind it. You need that kind of catalytic funding, which is not buried, as Paul suggests, in departmental accounts, basically, and jealously protected as such.
Hello, viewers. Sam again. My thanks to Vicky, Ian and Paul for letting me share that conversation with you. Look out for the other 3, which I will share on here in due course. They will feature conversations about grey belt, devolution and greater than local planning, and planning for infrastructure and the environment. Please do keep in mind, viewers, that 50 Shades of Planning is by planners and for planners. And so if you would like to use this channel for sharing anything you think that we need to be talking about, then do please feel free to get in touch with me via samstafford@hotmail.com. Please also feel free to share this video on your social platforms. Anybody that does will be entitled to an exclusive 50 Shades mug. Because, viewers, plugs mean mugs. My thanks to podcast partners Kratos, and a shout out especially to Luca Di Fato for production support. What have we learnt? Well, town and country planning is very much not a black and white endeavour. There are at least 50 shades in between. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of 50 Shades of Planning, which is brought to you in partnership with Kratos. Kratos are a leading communications consultancy providing integrated strategic communications and campaigns across multiple sectors. We have helped some of the UK's best known brands deliver local and national campaigns, manage political and reputational risks, and influence national policy on some of the most important issues facing the UK. We are more than an agency, we are change makers. Find out more at kratos.co.uk.